So the last thing for today are places connected with famous writers. So perhaps week 12 will be a bit longer than usual, but then again week 14, when we talk about the overseas territories, will be shorter, and I thought it would be useful perhaps for you to get more inspiration for your final presentations before the last moment. So let's look at some of the places connected with famous writers. So of course these are the places that generate a lot of tourism, especially among the admirers of the work of these historical characters, yeah, let's see what we can find. So of course the first one would be William Shakespeare. He generates a lot of tourist movement in Britain. So there are some places connected with Shakespeare, like the reconstruction of the Globe Theatre in London, but the place, the town connected with Shakespeare the most is Stratford upon Avon. That's what we have. We have some of the houses that belonged to the family of the Shakespeares. I think the original house in which William Shakespeare was born did not survive, but on the same location the family lived for quite a few generations, so the house was rebuilt and modernized, but it still is like a medieval or early Renaissance house made of half timbering, so with this very characteristic checked surface, combining wooden structure with brick or clay fillings. So here we have a house that belonged to the family of William Shakespeare, built on the place where Shakespeare was born. There is a very well preserved cottage, a large cottage that belonged to the family of Shakespeare's wife, Anne Hathaway. There is a school building which young William Shakespeare attended for a while, and of course one of the most important places is the local church where Shakespeare was christened, where he married, where his children were christened, and where eventually he is buried. So if you like William Shakespeare, go to Stratford upon Avon. It's really the entire town living off its main citizen. Another popular destination for the lovers of literature are the places connected with Jane Austen. Goodness me, so many planes. So actually Jane Austen moved around quite a while, so there are at least two places which feature her museums. One is in the city of Bath. In a townhouse, the family of Jane Austen lived there not for a long time, for just a few years. We know she was quite unhappy there, and the material situation of the family was not very good, especially after her father died. Then later she moved to a village called Chawton in Hampshire, and this is the main house of Jane Austen. So if you want to visit the place where Jane Austen actually lived for a long time, where she wrote most of her novels, the village of Chawton, and this small but quite cozy little house where she lived with her mother and her sister. They were both unmarried, so they were basically provided for by her brothers. This is where you can find. Towards the end of her life, when Jane Austen's health started to fail, she was advised to travel, and eventually death caught her in Winchester. So we are back in Winchester at the cathedral, so the old Anglo-Saxon capital city, and inside the cathedral you can find the tombstone of Jane Austen, who died in a small house, rented basically accommodation nearby, and was buried in the cathedral. What else? We have the Bronte sisters, so another wonderful place, very well preserved home in the local parsonage in the village of Haworth in West Yorkshire, where the father of the Bronte siblings was a local pastor. And the talented sisters and the brother lived, worked, and eventually died. They are all buried next to the house in the church where their father worked. And it's not only the parsonage and the graveyard and the church which are interesting, but the entire village, of course, profits from the Brontes. You can visit a local pub where their brother Bramwell was getting drunk, and this was basically the death of him. You can walk around the moors, which inspired so much in their novels. There are some ruined farms which are said to inspire at least the location of Wuthering Heights and other places described in the novels of the Bronte sisters. There is a waterfall they visited when they were young. They all loved walking in the moors, and so it's a beautiful natural area. And of course, most people who come to Haworth also go to walk the moors. I did it. It's lovely. Go and see it. Next writer is Charles Dickens. So the greatest 19th century novelist, and again he moved quite a lot around England. He started from very humble beginnings, and you are probably well familiar with the story that for a while his father was in prison for debts, and the entire family, including young Charles Dickens, had to work to pay his debts. So this was a kind of childhood trauma he always returned to in his novels. So two places connected with Charles Dickens. One is his museum in London, in central London, actually near the British Museum, in one of the pretty Victorian terraced houses. The entire house is used for the museum, and this is the place where Dickens and his family lived for quite a long while. Also his sister-in-law, his wife's younger sister, whom he loved very much, died there. So this was a house that was connected with some family tragedy here. Another place which is very close to Charles Dickens is the town of Rochester, and this is where they have annual celebrations and festivals of Dickens's novels. Let's now move a little bit back, and here we have another house, this time in Buckinghamshire, a rather big and quite spacious cottage house in the village of Chalford St Giles, which belonged to John Milton, the great poet, famous mostly for his Paradise Lost. He was well respected shortly after his death already, so his house was preserved and turned into a museum. This is what happens quite a lot to the places of famous novelists and poets in Britain. is a culture that values their creative people quite a lot. Another house, I mentioned Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson already, the one who came up with the idea of the black dog. He was an intellectual and a writer. In 18th century, he lived in London much of the time, and luckily for us his house survives, and it's in one of the areas of London that have this very charming historical ambience to them, and this 18th century house called Dr. Johnson's house survives and houses a museum. Two more poets from the 19th century, from the early 19th century. One is John Clare, sometimes called the peasant poet, a romantic poet of sorts. Quite an unfortunate man. He suffered also from some sort of mental problems, but still he wrote beautiful poetry, and the fact that he came from a small village also adds to perhaps the quality of his talent. So he was a kind of homegrown genius, and the house where he lived, called Clare Cottage, can be found in the village of Helpstone in Cambridgeshire. We also have two places connected with the national poet of Scotland, that is Robert Burns. We have Burns's cottage in Alloway, the place where he was born, also in very humble surroundings, and one of the places where he lived later on, called Burns's house, now of course in the city of Dumfries in southern Scotland. Robert Burns, the national poet of Scotland, and if we talk about the national novelist of Scotland, then of course this would be Sir Walter Scott, and he had a kind of changeable fortunes in life. He sometimes made a lot of money, then he lost it, then he was rich again, and he lost it again. But from the moment in his life when he was really wealthy, he acquired this wonderful residence called Abbotsford, also in the south of Scotland, the Scottish borders with England, of course. This beautiful manor house was preserved and now is used as a museum and a kind of historical residence connected to Sir Walter Scott. Some more names. So we have Thomas Hardy, late 19th century, the author of Death of the D'Urbervilles and Mill on the Floss. No, it's not. Death of the D'Urbervilles and Return of the Native, that's his. His career was basically mostly connected with Dorset, and especially the little town of Dorchester. He lived there, he was buried there. Here we have the house that belonged to him, and if you go to Dorchester, it's basically Thomas Hardy country. Next late 19th century author was an American who moved to Britain and had a very good career there, Henry James, also a novelist. The Portrait of the Lady, for example, his probably most famous work, but many other well-respected and well-known late 19th century or turn of the century novels, the Bostonians, for example. When he decided to move from America, he settled in a very picturesque and historical and beautiful village called Rye in East Sussex. So here we have a kind of street view of Rye and also the house that Henry James used to live. some more places. Let's now move to the Lake District and the writers connected with the Lake District. The first one, so in Cumbria, would be Beatrix Potter. She was a writer and an illustrator, mostly specializing in books for children, but still well respected and well known today. If you recall, perhaps from your childhood, the stories of cute little animals like Peter Rabbit and his friends, this is the work of Beatrix Potter, and this is where she lived in this cottage in the Lake District. Also, the Romantic poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge at least occasionally visited Cumbria, so the Lake District, and rented accommodation there. And the place where they spent most time, mostly Wordsworth, is called Dove Cottage, and this is again another pretty little house in the picturesque area of the Lake District connected with literature. At other times, Wordsworth and Coleridge, who were the best friends ever, lived mostly as neighbors in Somerset, and there is another house that survives as a museum today called Coleridge Cottage in Somerset. Some more people, as you can see, there are quite a lot of such places, and probably if you have a favorite English if you have a favorite English writer, just make sure their house is not available for visitors, because it's very likely it might be. Like the house of Virginia Woolf, her home in East Sussex called Monk's House, with a beautiful garden, so another place connected with literature, this time turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century. Some more early 20th century names and places. Rudyard Kipling, also the citizen of East Sussex, and this is the house he owned. This is called Bateman's. So quite a large and impressive house to be visited mostly by the fans of Rudyard Kipling. If you like the work of Agatha Christie, you can visit the residence of her in Greenway in Devon. So this is one of the places where she lived as a successful writer. Actually, one of the adaptations of her novels made by the BBC was filmed there, so it's quite interesting to see these places still living and connected with the literature that inspired them. Two more names. One is one of the most famous poets, British poets of the 20th century, Dylan Thomas, in Wales. He was a Welshman, and what you can visit now is a little house on the lake in the county of Carmarthenshire, which has the name of the Boathouse. The Boathouse, because originally it was used as a boathouse, he used it as a kind of writing lodge. The last one here on the list is connected with Roald Dahl, another respected and beloved author of children's literature, and his village where he lived, Great Missenden in Buckinghamshire, has Roald Dahl Museum and Story Centre. So his home is converted not only in a museum but a kind of place for children for all kinds of literary events and the propagation of reading, mostly reading of Roald Dahl stories. So there we go. I hope you find it inspirational. If you have some other literary favorites, check out, and perhaps you'll find something else. I'll be very interested to hear from you next week. So, thank you.